Before you begin, write in the comments which city and country you're watching us from. This channel exists to record stories that should never have been forgotten. In March 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, a Union officer stationed in occupied New Orleans wrote a letter to his commanding general that was immediately classified. The letter described an encounter with a young woman, the daughter of an enslaved mother and her former master, who had somehow acquired an education so advanced that she surpassed Harvard-trained scholars in multiple disciplines. The officer requested permission to bring her north, to introduce her to the intellectual circles of Boston and Philadelphia, to prove that the racist theories justifying slavery were scientifically false. His request was denied. The woman was ordered to remain silent. Her achievements were to be concealed, not because they were unimpressive, but because they were too impressive, because if the world knew what she had accomplished, it would shatter every argument the Confederacy used to justify its existence, and raise uncomfortable questions about complicity in the North as well. What you're about to hear is reconstructed from military correspondence, private diaries, university records that were sealed for a century, and testimony from witnesses who were warned never to speak. This is not legend. This is what they deliberately hid. New Orleans in 1863 was a city suspended between two worlds. Captured by Union forces in April 1862, it remained occupied throughout the war, serving as a strategic port and a symbol of federal authority in the Deep South. But occupation did not mean equality. Even under Union control, the city's racial hierarchy remained largely intact. Free people of color, who had comprised a significant portion of New Orleans society before the war, found themselves in a precarious position, no longer enslaved, but not yet equal. And the formerly enslaved, suddenly freed by military decree, discovered that legal freedom did not automatically translate into social acceptance or opportunity. In this volatile environment lived a young woman named Marguerite Laurent. She was 19 years old in 1863, the daughter of an enslaved woman named Céleste and a French Creole planter named Edouard Laurent. Her existence was both ordinary and extraordinary. Mixed-race children born into slavery were common in Louisiana, where the gens de couleur libre, free people of color, had created a complex social structure that blurred the stark racial boundaries found elsewhere in the South. But Marguerite was different, not because of her parentage, which was typical, but because of what she had done with the peculiar circumstances of her upbringing. Edouard Laurent had died in 1858, when Marguerite was 14. In his will, discovered in the Orleans Parish Archives in 1892, and largely ignored until a graduate student found it in 1969, Laurent had made an unusual provision. He had freed both Céleste and Marguerite, and left them a modest sum of money. But more significantly, he had left detailed instructions regarding Marguerite's education. The will specified that she was to be tutored in French, Latin, mathematics, natural philosophy, and music. Laurent had even named a specific tutor, a former professor from the Collège d'Orléans, and allocated funds to pay for her instruction until she reached the age of 21. This provision was extraordinary. Louisiana law in the 1850s did not prohibit the education of free people of color in the same way that other southern states prohibited the education of the enslaved. But education beyond basic literacy was rare, and advanced education for a woman of color was virtually unprecedented. Laurent's motivations remain unclear. Some historians have speculated that he genuinely cared for Marguerite and wanted to provide for her future. Others have suggested that he was motivated by guilt or by a desire to demonstrate that black intellectual capacity was equal to white capacity, a belief that would have been considered radical, even heretical, in 1850s Louisiana. Whatever his motivations, the result was remarkable. From 1858 to 1863, Marguerite received an education, that rivaled what was available to the sons of wealthy white families and exceeded what was available to most white women, who were generally limited to decorative accomplishments like music and needlework. Her tutor, Professor Antoine Mercier, kept detailed records of her progress. These records, preserved in his personal papers and donated to Tulane University in 1947, reveal a student of exceptional ability. Professor Mercier noted in his journal, dated October 1859, that Marguerite had mastered Latin grammar in 6 months, a task that typically took students 2 years. By 1860, she was reading Virgil and Cicero in the original Latin and had begun studying Greek. By 1861, she had progressed to advanced mathematics, including calculus and analytical geometry. Professor Mercier wrote, "I have taught for 30 years at universities in France and in Louisiana, and I have never encountered a mind like Marguerite's. She does not simply learn, she comprehends immediately, makes connections I had not considered, and asks questions that force me to reconsider my own understanding. I'm no longer teaching her, I am collaborating with her." But this education was conducted in secret. Professor Mercier came to Marguerite's home, a small but comfortable house in the Faubourg Marigny, purchased with the funds from her father's estate. No one outside the household knew the extent of her studies. Céleste, Marguerite's mother, insisted on this secrecy. She understood that Marguerite's education, if publicly known, would attract attention, and attention could be dangerous. Even in cosmopolitan New Orleans, even among the free people of color, a woman with such advanced learning would be viewed with suspicion, envy, or hostility. And so Marguerite studied in isolation. She read voraciously, not just the classical texts assigned by Professor Mercier, but also contemporary works in science, philosophy, and political theory. She taught herself English, using newspapers and books imported from the north. She studied astronomy, using a small telescope she had purchased with her own savings. She composed music, filling notebooks with original compositions that Professor Mercier described as technically proficient and emotionally profound. All of this remained hidden until the Union occupation of New Orleans in 1862 changed everything. Before we continue, leave a comment. Have you ever had to hide your abilities to protect yourself? The Union occupation brought new opportunities and new dangers for people of color in New Orleans. General Benjamin Butler, the military governor, issued orders integrating streetcars, opening schools for black children, and recognizing the civil rights of free people of color. These policies enraged white Southerners and made Butler one of the most hated figures in Confederate territory. But they also created a moment of possibility, a brief window when people like Marguerite could imagine a future beyond the constraints of the old racial order. In January 1863, Marguerite made a decision that would change her life. She wrote a letter to Colonel Thomas Higginson, a Union officer and abolitionist who was stationed in New Orleans and known for his support of black education. In her letter, written in flawless English, she offered her services as a translator and interpreter. She explained that she was fluent in French, English, and Latin, and that she had studied enough Spanish and Italian to read documents in those languages as well. Colonel Higginson was intrigued. He invited Marguerite to his headquarters for an interview. According to Higginson's diary, discovered in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives in 1934, the interview did not go as he expected. He had anticipated meeting a reasonably educated young woman who might be useful for translating French correspondence. New Orleans was a bilingual city, and the Union Army frequently needed translators. What he encountered was something entirely different. Higginson tested Marguerite's abilities by giving her a complex legal document written in French, filled with technical terminology. She translated it instantly, orally, with complete accuracy. He then gave her a passage from Tacitus in Latin. She not only translated it, but also provided historical context and discussed the grammatical structures Tacitus had used. Higginson, who had graduated from Harvard and considered himself well-educated, found himself struggling to keep up with her analysis. But it was what happened next that truly astonished him. Higginson, curious about the extent of her knowledge, began asking her questions about subjects beyond languages. He asked her about mathematics. She solved complex algebraic equations without paper, explaining her reasoning as she went. He asked her about astronomy. She described the current positions of the planets, explained Kepler's laws of planetary motion, and discussed recent observations of Mars that had been published in scientific journals she had somehow obtained and read. Higginson wrote in his diary, "I came to this interview expecting to hire a translator. I left having met one of the most educated individuals I have ever encountered, regardless of race or gender. Miss Laurent's knowledge is not superficial. It is deep, rigorous, and self-directed. She has educated herself beyond what most men achieve, with every advantage, and she has done so in secret, in a society that would have punished her for the attempt. I am both awed and disturbed. Awed by her achievement, disturbed by the waste, the fact that such a mind has been hidden, that it could contribute so much and has been given no opportunity to do so." Higginson hired Marguerite immediately. She began working at Union headquarters, translating documents, interpreting for French-speaking civilians, and assisting with administrative tasks. But her role quickly expanded beyond translation. Officers began consulting her on matters of strategy, logistics, and even diplomacy. She had an uncanny ability to analyze complex situations, identify patterns, and propose solutions that others had overlooked. One incident, documented in military correspondence from March 1863, illustrates her impact. The Union forces were struggling with a supply problem. Shipments of food and medicine were arriving in New Orleans, but were not reaching troops stationed in the surrounding parishes. The system seemed chaotic, with no clear reason for the delays. Marguerite, after reviewing the shipping manifests and transportation logs, identified the problem. A group of corrupt civilian contractors was deliberately routing shipments through unnecessary intermediaries, inflating costs and pocketing the difference. She documented the scheme with such precision that the contractors were arrested and the system was reformed within weeks. The officer who had requested her analysis, Major William Sturgis, wrote, "Miss Laurent accomplished in 3 days what our quartermaster's department had failed to accomplish in 3 months. Her mind works like a calculating machine, precise, rapid, and unerring." But as Marguerite's competence became more visible, so did the complications. Some officers welcomed her contributions, others resented her presence. A woman, a person of color, offering strategic advice to white male officers. It violated every social norm, even in the supposedly progressive Union Army. Complaints were made. Letters were written to superior officers, questioning whether it was appropriate for Marguerite to be working in such a prominent role. Colonel Higginson defended her vigorously. In a letter to General Nathaniel Banks, who had replaced Butler as military governor, Higginson argued that Marguerite's abilities were too valuable to waste because of prejudice. He wrote, "Miss Laurent possesses an intellect that would be recognized as exceptional in any context. To dismiss her because of her race or sex would be not only unjust, but strategically foolish. She is an asset to our cause, and we would be wise to utilize her talents fully." General Banks was sympathetic but cautious. He allowed Marguerite to continue working but imposed restrictions. She was not to attend meetings with senior officers. She was not to be given access to classified military information. She was to work quietly, behind the scenes, without drawing attention. Banks explained his reasoning in a letter to Higginson. "I do not doubt Miss Laurent's abilities or her loyalty. But we must be mindful of appearances. Our goal is to restore the Union and end slavery. but we cannot move faster than public opinion will allow. If word spreads that we are relying on a colored woman for strategic advice, it will provide ammunition to our enemies and alienate potential allies in the North. For her own sake, and for the sake of our cause, she must remain in the background. Marguerite understood the calculation. She had no illusions about the limitations imposed on her by her race and gender. She continued working, accepting the restrictions, because she believed in the Union cause and saw the war as an opportunity to contribute to the end of slavery. But she also recognized the bitter irony. Even as the Union fought to free the enslaved, it was not ready to accept black intellectual equality. This tension came to a head in July 1863, following the Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The war's momentum had shifted, and there was growing confidence in the North that victory was achievable. In this atmosphere, Colonel Higginson renewed his proposal to bring Marguerite north. He wanted to introduce her to the intellectual and abolitionist circles in Boston, to Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, the faculty at Harvard. He believed that Marguerite's existence, her achievements, could serve as powerful evidence against the racist ideology that still pervaded Northern society. Higginson wrote to several prominent abolitionists, describing Marguerite's abilities and suggesting that she could become a symbol, a living refutation of the claim that black people were intellectually inferior. The responses he received were mixed. Some abolitionists were enthusiastic. Wendell Phillips wrote, "If Miss Laurent is as exceptional as you describe, she must be brought forward. The world needs to see what black people can achieve when given the opportunity. Her story could change minds, could accelerate the cause of equality." But others were more cautious. Frederick Douglass, in a letter that has only recently been published, expressed concern about the burden such visibility would place on Marguerite. He wrote, "I understand Colonel Higginson's intentions, and I do not doubt that Miss Laurent is remarkable. But I have lived my entire life as a symbol, as an example, and I know the cost. To be put on display, to have your every achievement scrutinized, to be held up as proof that your race is worthy of respect, it is exhausting, and it is dehumanizing. Miss Laurent should be allowed to determine her own path, not be conscripted into service as evidence in a debate she did not choose." Douglass's caution proved prescient. When Higginson submitted his proposal to his superiors, requesting permission to bring Marguerite to Boston and introduce her to the public, the response was an unequivocal refusal. General Banks wrote, "Your proposal is denied. Miss Laurent will remain in New Orleans and will continue her current duties. She is not to be brought north, and she is not to be introduced to the press or to public figures." This decision is final. The reasoning behind this refusal was spelled out in a confidential memorandum declassified only in 1963 on the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. In the memorandum, a senior War Department official explained, "While we acknowledge Miss Laurent's abilities, we cannot allow her to become a public figure at this time. The war effort depends on maintaining a coalition that includes conservative elements in the North who support the Union but are ambivalent about racial equality. If we present a colored woman as an intellectual equal or superior to white scholars, we risk alienating these elements. Furthermore, if Miss Laurent were to be celebrated in the North, it would provide the Confederacy with propaganda. They would claim that we are promoting race mixing and social upheaval. For strategic reasons, Miss Laurent's achievements must remain confidential until after the war is concluded." In other words, Marguerite was too dangerous to be acknowledged. Her existence challenged not just Confederate ideology, but also Northern assumptions. Even among Union supporters, many believed that black people were inferior and required white guidance. Marguerite's achievements threatened that belief. And so, she had to be hidden, not by the Confederacy, which never knew she existed, but by the Union she served. Higginson was furious. In his diary he wrote, We are fighting a war to end slavery, yet we perpetuate the same prejudices that justified slavery. We claim to believe in equality, yet we hide evidence of that equality when it becomes inconvenient. Marguerite Laurent is brilliant, and she is being silenced not by our enemies but by our own side. This is a betrayal, and I am ashamed to be complicit in it. But Higginson could not disobey orders. Marguerite remained in New Orleans, working in obscurity, her contributions unacknowledged. And as the war continued, the restrictions on her became more severe. In late 1863, following the New York draft riots, where white mobs attacked black residents, driven by racist fury and resentment of the war, military officials became even more cautious about anything that might inflame racial tensions. Marguerite was reassigned from headquarters to a less visible position, working in a records office, cataloguing documents and translating routine correspondence. She accepted this demotion without protest, at least publicly. But privately, according to a journal she kept, fragments of which were discovered in the 1980s in a private collection, she struggled with anger and despair. In one entry dated November 1863, she wrote, "I have done everything they asked. I have proven my abilities beyond question, and still I am invisible. My mind is useful to them, but only as long as it remains hidden. They will take my work, but they will not acknowledge my existence. Is this freedom? Is this what we are fighting for?" The journal reveals a woman caught between hope and disillusionment. Marguerite believed in the cause of abolition. She understood that the war, for all its flaws and compromises, represented a chance to destroy the system of slavery that had oppressed her mother and millions of others. But she also recognized that legal freedom would not automatically bring equality. The same people who claimed to oppose slavery often harbored deep prejudices against black intellectual capacity. They could accept black people as laborers, even as soldiers, but not as equals in the realm of thought. This contradiction was brought into sharp focus in early 1864, when Marguerite was asked to assist with a project that would ultimately define her legacy and ensure her erasure. The Union Army was conducting a study of education among freed people in occupied Louisiana. The goal was to assess literacy rates, identify educational needs, and develop recommendations for post-war reconstruction. Marguerite was assigned to help collect data, interview teachers and students, and analyze the results. She threw herself into the work. She visited schools, spoke with students and teachers, reviewed test scores and attendance records. And what she found was both encouraging and troubling. Many freed people were eager to learn, and literacy rates were rising rapidly wherever schools were established. But the quality of education varied wildly. Some schools were well-funded and staffed by dedicated teachers from the North. Others were overcrowded, under-resourced, and staffed by teachers who doubted their students' abilities. Marguerite documented these disparities in a detailed report. But she went further. She used statistical analysis to demonstrate that black students, when given adequate resources and instruction, performed at the same level as white students. She compared test scores from integrated schools in New Orleans with scores from segregated schools and showed that race was not a predictor of academic success, but resources were. She argued, based on her data, that educational inequality was a product of discrimination, not innate difference. Her report was revolutionary. It was one of the first rigorous, data-driven studies to challenge racist assumptions about black intellectual capacity. It should have been published, disseminated, used to inform policy. Instead, it was classified. The officer who supervised the project, Major George Eaton, wrote in a memo, "Miss Laurent's report is thorough and well-reasoned, but its conclusions are too provocative for public release." While I do not dispute her findings, I believe that presenting this level of analysis from a colored woman would generate controversy and undermine the report's credibility. I recommend that the data be incorporated into our official report. but that Miss Laurent's authorship not be acknowledged. And that is exactly what happened. The Union Army published a report on education in Louisiana in 1864. It included Marguerite's data, her analysis, her recommendations. But her name was not mentioned. The report was attributed to the supervising officers, all white men, none of whom had conducted the actual research. Marguerite learned of this decision in March 1864. According to her journal, her initial reaction was shock, followed by resignation. She wrote, "I should have known. I have always known. They will use my work, but they will never give me credit for it. In their eyes, I am a tool, not a person. My mind is valuable, but my identity is an inconvenience, so they take what they need and erase me from the record. This is how they will write history, taking the contributions of people like me and pretending they never existed." But Marguerite did not stop working. Despite the betrayal, despite the erasure, she continued. Perhaps she believed that her work mattered regardless of whether she received recognition. Perhaps she hoped that someday the truth would come out. Or perhaps she simply had no other choice. In a world that offered few opportunities for women of color, even this constrained, unacknowledged work was better than nothing. In the final year of the war, Marguerite's role diminished further. As the Union advanced and the Confederacy collapsed, military priorities shifted. The need for translators and analysts in New Orleans decreased. Marguerite was eventually let go from her position in late 1864, with a letter of recommendation that praised her diligence and reliability, but made no mention of her intellectual contributions. After the war ended in April 1865, Marguerite faced an uncertain future. Reconstruction brought legal changes. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship, the 15th Amendment protected voting rights for black men, though not for women of any race. But social attitudes changed more slowly. The promise of equality remained largely unfulfilled. Marguerite attempted to continue her intellectual work. In 1866, she applied to several universities in the North, seeking admission as a student or a position as an instructor. She was rejected by all of them. Some rejections were polite but firm. "We do not admit women." Others were more explicitly racist. "We do not accept students of the colored race." One university administrator wrote, "While we acknowledge your evident education, we cannot set a precedent that would disrupt the social order of our institution." Blocked from formal academic positions, Marguerite turned to writing. She composed essays on education, political theory, and philosophy. She submitted them to journals and newspapers under a male pseudonym, a common practice for women writers at the time. Some were published, others were rejected. Those that were published were generally well received, but because they appeared under a pseudonym, they did not advance Marguerite's reputation or career. She remained invisible. In 1868, she briefly taught at a school for freed people in New Orleans. The school was funded by the Freedmen's Bureau and staffed mostly by Northern teachers. Marguerite, despite her superior education, was paid less than her white colleagues and given the most difficult classes. The students who were considered unteachable because they were older, had no prior education, and faced overwhelming obstacles outside of school. She succeeded where others had failed. Her students learned to read and write, often progressing in months what typically took years. But when the school's director wrote reports celebrating the success of the program, Marguerite's name was not mentioned. By 1870, Marguerite had largely withdrawn from public life. She lived quietly in New Orleans, supporting herself by giving private lessons in French and music to the children of well-off families, both white and black. She continued to read, to write, to think, but she no longer sought recognition or validation. She had learned that the world was not ready for her, and she had made peace with that reality. Professor Mercier, her former tutor, died in 1872. In his will, he left his personal papers to Tulane University, with instructions that they not be opened until 1920. He wanted, perhaps, to give history time to catch up with Marguerite's achievements. Among his papers were his journals documenting her education, along with a letter addressed to whom it may concern. In the letter, Mercier wrote, "I have taught many students in my career, but none so brilliant as Marguerite Laurent. She possessed an intellect of the highest order, rigorous, creative, and insatiably curious. She was denied opportunities because of her race and her sex, and that denial is a tragedy not just for her, but for the world. She could have been a scholar, a scientist, a philosopher. Instead, she was hidden, ignored, and forgotten. I write this so that someday someone will know the truth. Marguerite Laurent was one of the great minds of her generation, and she deserved better than what this world gave her." Marguerite lived into the 20th century. She died in 1921 at the age of 77 in the same house where she had received her education as a girl. Her death went largely unnoticed. A brief obituary appeared in a local newspaper, noting only that she had been a music teacher and a member of the St. Augustine Church. There was no mention of her work for the Union Army, her contributions to educational policy, or her extraordinary intellectual achievements. Her papers, her journal, her essays, her correspondence were left to her niece, who had no idea of their significance. They remained in a trunk in an attic for decades, surviving by chance. It was not until 1969, during the Civil Rights Movement, when historians were actively searching for lost narratives of Black achievement, that Marguerite's story began to emerge. Dr. Eleanor Price, a historian at Tulane University researching the Union occupation of New Orleans, was reviewing the papers of Professor Mercier when she discovered his journals about Marguerite. Intrigued, Dr. Price began searching for corroborating evidence. She found Colonel Higginson's diary. She found the military correspondence about Marguerite's work and the debate over whether to bring her north. She found the 1864 education report and discovered, through comparison with military records, that Marguerite had conducted the actual research. Dr. Price's breakthrough came when she located Marguerite's niece, who was still alive and living in New Orleans. The niece remembered Marguerite as a quiet, dignified woman who had never spoken much about her past. But she still had the trunk of papers. Dr. Price examined them and found Marguerite's journal, her letters, and drafts of essays she had written. The evidence was overwhelming. Marguerite Laurent had been exactly what Professor Mercier claimed, one of the most educated and capable individuals of her time, deliberately concealed and erased from history. Dr. Price published her findings in 1973 in a book titled The Hidden Intellectual, Marguerite Laurent and the Suppression of Black Achievement During Reconstruction. The book received significant attention in academic circles and was praised for recovering a lost voice from history, but it also generated controversy. Some historians questioned whether Marguerite's achievements had been exaggerated, whether the documents could be trusted, whether Dr. Price was reading too much into limited evidence. These questions reveal a persistent double standard. When white historical figures left behind fragmentary evidence of their achievements, historians typically gave them the benefit of the doubt, filling in gaps with reasonable inferences. But when Black historical figures left similar evidence, they faced skepticism and demands for extraordinary proof. Marguerite's case was no exception. Despite extensive documentation, journals, military correspondence, testimony from multiple witnesses, some scholars remained unconvinced. They wanted more proof, more evidence, more certainty. They could not accept that a Black woman in the 1860s could have been as brilliant as the evidence suggested. But as more research has been conducted and as more documents have been discovered, the case for Marguerite's achievements has only grown stronger. In 1985, a historian at Harvard discovered a letter in the university archives from Colonel Higginson to Ralph Waldo Emerson, describing Marguerite and arguing that she should be admitted to Harvard as a special student. Emerson's response was sympathetic but pessimistic. I do not doubt that Miss Laurent possesses the intellectual capacity for university study, but Harvard is not prepared to admit women, let alone women of color. I fear she is a generation ahead of her time. In 1992, a descendant of Major William Sturgis donated his papers to the National Archives. Among them was a letter in which Sturgis described Marguerite's analysis of the supply corruption scheme and praised her detective-like precision and analytical brilliance. He concluded, "If Miss Laurent had been born a white man, she would be teaching at a university. Instead, she is filing documents in a records office. This is an injustice that future generations will condemn us for." And in 2008, a retired schoolteacher in New Orleans discovered a small, leather-bound book in her grandmother's belongings. The book contained musical compositions in Marguerite's hand, complex pieces for piano and voice, technically sophisticated and emotionally rich. A musicologist who examined the compositions described them as comparable to the work of professional composers of the period, demonstrating mastery of European classical forms and incorporation of Creole musical traditions. The compositions had never been performed publicly. Marguerite had composed them for herself, with no expectation that anyone would ever hear them. Each new discovery has confirmed what Dr. Price argued in 1973. Marguerite Laurent was a person of extraordinary talent and achievement, deliberately hidden from history because her existence challenged the racial and gender hierarchies of her time. She was not an exception or an anomaly. She was evidence of what black people could accomplish when given even limited opportunities, and that evidence was too dangerous to acknowledge. The question that haunts Marguerite's story is not whether she was brilliant. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is why her brilliance had to be concealed. Why did the Union Army, which was fighting to end slavery, refuse to allow her achievements to be known? Why did northern universities, which claimed to value education and merit, refuse to admit her? Why did a society that prided itself on progress and enlightenment find it necessary to hide her? The answer is uncomfortable but clear. Marguerite's existence threatened the foundations of white supremacy. If she could achieve so much, despite every obstacle, poverty, racism, lack of formal education, gender discrimination, then the entire justification for racial hierarchy collapsed. If one black woman could be as intelligent as the most educated white men, then the claims of innate racial superiority were false. And if those claims were false, then slavery had been a crime, segregation was a crime, and the ongoing oppression of black people could not be justified. This recognition would have required white Americans, both North and South, to confront their complicity in a vast moral wrong. It would have required them to acknowledge that black people were not inferior, that they had been deliberately denied opportunities, and that this denial had wasted countless lives and incalculable potential. It would have required a fundamental restructuring of society, not just legally, but socially and psychologically. And so, instead of confronting this uncomfortable truth, they hid it. They took Marguerite's work and attributed it to others. They praised her abilities in private while denying her recognition in public. They claimed to value merit while ensuring that her merit remained invisible. And after her death, they let her story fade into obscurity, erased from the historical record as if she had never existed. But she did exist. The documents prove it. The letters, the journals, the military correspondence, the compositions, all of it confirms that Marguerite Laurent lived, achieved, and was deliberately concealed. Her story is not a legend or a myth. It is a documented case of historical erasure, a deliberate suppression of evidence that contradicted the dominant racial ideology. And Marguerite's case is not unique. As historians have dug deeper into the archives, they have found other stories like hers, black intellectuals, writers, scientists, and scholars whose achievements were hidden or minimized. These individuals existed in the gaps of history, achieving extraordinary things while remaining invisible to the larger society. Their stories are difficult to recover because they were so thoroughly suppressed, but each recovered story adds to our understanding of what was lost. Marguerite understood her own erasure. In one of her final journal entries, dated 1918, 3 years before her death, she reflected on her life. "I have lived long enough to see some progress. Black people can vote, at least in theory. Schools are open to us, though segregated and unequal. But the fundamental attitudes have not changed. We are still seen as inferior, still required to prove our worth over and over, still denied recognition even when we excel. I do not know if this will ever change, but I know that I existed, I know what I achieved, and I know that someday, perhaps long after I'm gone, someone will find these words and know the truth. That will have to be enough. It took 50 years. But someone did find her words. Dr. Price found them, and through her work Marguerite's story became known. Not famous, not widely celebrated, but known, preserved, acknowledged. In 1995, a historical marker was placed near the site of Marguerite's home in the Faubourg Marigny. It reads, Marguerite Laurent, 1844-1921, educator, scholar, and unrecognized intellectual whose achievements were concealed during her lifetime. Her story represents the countless black individuals whose contributions to American history have been erased. In 2004, a small scholarship fund was established in Marguerite's name at Tulane University, supporting black women pursuing graduate studies in history, education, or the humanities. It is a modest legacy, but it is something. It acknowledges that Marguerite existed, that her achievements mattered, and that the suppression of her story was a loss that should not be repeated. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in 2015, when a group of musicians in New Orleans performed Marguerite's compositions publicly for the first time, 150 years after they were written. The concert was held at St. Augustine Church, where Marguerite had worshipped. The audience, a mix of historians, community members, and descendants of free people of color, listened as Marguerite's music filled the church, complex and beautiful, a voice from the past finally being heard. One attendee interviewed afterward said, "Listening to that music, I kept thinking about all the voices we've lost, all the people like Marguerite who had something to say, something to contribute, and were never allowed to be heard. We can't bring them back. We can't undo the injustice, but we can remember. We can make sure their stories aren't lost again." That is what Marguerite's story offers, not redemption, but remembrance. She was brilliant, and she was hidden. She achieved extraordinary things, and she was erased. She deserved recognition, and she was denied it. These are facts, documented and undeniable. And they raise questions that we still struggle with today. How many other Marguerites were there? How much potential has been wasted because of racism and sexism? How many contributions to science, art, philosophy, and culture have been lost because the people who made them were deemed unworthy of recognition? We cannot answer these questions definitively. The historical record is too fragmented, too incomplete, too compromised by the very erasure it documents. But we can acknowledge the loss. We can recognize that history as we know it is partial and biased, that it has systematically excluded the voices of marginalized people, and that recovering those voices is both a scholarly obligation and a moral imperative. Marguerite Laurent's story is one small piece of that larger recovery. It is a reminder that brilliance is not limited by race or gender, that opportunity creates achievement, and that suppression destroys potential. It is evidence of what could have been and what was denied, and it is a testament to the resilience of truth, that even when deliberately concealed, even when buried under layers of silence and erasure, truth can eventually emerge. The documents exist. The evidence is there. And Marguerite, though erased from history during her lifetime, is erased no longer. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with others who care about recovering lost histories. And let us know in the comments, what other hidden stories from the past do you think deserve to be told?